Now, there's a real question of this website. The Grace machine, the idea of the Grace machine is related to, as you probably know, to the book The Grace and Gravity that I published a bit over a year ago with Bloomsbury. Now there is a similarity between them. I'm not sure if you've looked at the book or you read parts of it or maybe read the whole thing, but you see it's quite modular. It does work with fragments, not really in the sense of, let's say, Calvino or Oulipo, the authors of Oulipo, but there is a notion of parts that are loose and they return throughout the book. And that makes the book a sort of machine, and that's explained in the final chapter. But that also allowed us to come up with this notion of a Grace machine, and especially the Grace machine as a website. So can you actually think in modules or maybe in fragments, because a module sounds like everything is fixed from the outside and is made to fit with other parts, and fragments, of course, you have to figure out how they might fit. And I think that's probably a better term. We'll get to the notion of fragments with Roland Barthes, but that's sort of what makes it a machine. So we get the Grace machine as a concept that's worked out in the book, and you see the diagram here, which is a hilariously difficult to understand diagram, but we get to that, especially on Thursday. But that's a sort of machine, and then the website is a machine, and the book is a sort of machine, and they intersect with this notion of the 5 postures. And I think what really helps is that the 5 postures are sort of both a rereading of the Grace and Gravity book, but also a more accessible reading, a more open reading. Of course, it foregrounds the notion of figure and posture much more than, let's say, the Grace and Gravity book itself. But it also makes it a smaller book. And because the book's pretty heavy. And this notion of the postures actually allows us to, create a structure of exchange. I didn't mention Roland Barthes in Grace and Gravity, but I found that the book A Lover's Discourse and also How to Live Together, beautiful book, where there's this quite fantastic quote: "The fragments of discourse can be called figures." So that's the central notion. Though he immediately displaces that idea of the figure, not in rhetoric, right? Not as in the Greek meaning of schema. We have to pronounce it. I mean, it's because schema is not schema. Schema is, of course, for us it's an organizational term. The schema of a building would be, or a schema of a sculpture, or the schema of an event would be an organizational structure. Would be virtual in that sense or abstract. Now, schema is actually the plastic form, is a much more an external form. What's immediately interesting about that is that he says, well, it's not that, it's in a much livelier way. It's a body's gesture caught in action. So it's non-rhetorical, or it displaces the rhetoric in a form of action. So the figure is not a static thing, it's an acting thing, and by its actions it changes and develops, and so as a concept it's very different from the notion of a concept or a symbol or an idea. So it's an acting thing, it's embodied, and it does immediately introduce the notion of posture, obviously. So athletes, orators, and statues. Let me move forward. Now, I'm using a lot of metaphors or models of animals in the Grace and Gravity book. And again, for the 5 postures of our grace machine, these 5 animals will be very important. You will see them returning over and over. Of course, the horse, um, as a model of stance or standing, with its incredibly abstract legs, but its very complicated rhythms of trot and canter and gallop, has this is a very powerful model of how a form can inhabit this plane. And how it actually stands. It's one of the most abstract animals in that sense. Dolphins, they're not mentioned very often in the book. Of course, they link to the Minoan culture, but as a model of play almost, and jumping, they are a very strong image. So you returning to those, the orangutan hanging. I'm not sure if you all saw the lectures. We had problem with the video. So, but the idea of the ape is also apery. It's not just hanging by the hand, as opposed to the horse standing on its hooves. As one is like inhabiting that plane, that sort of a horizontal plane of foot space, which I call foot space, and the other is like this inhabiting the space of things and pensile grabbing of things. It's also a form of apery, of mimesis and imitation, because it depends, right? A mimetic relation depends on what you imitate. So that's why stance is called in philosophy mind independent. So it's not hanging from. Dependent means literally hanging from. As you know, maybe from German, abhängig. So in that sense, stance is unabhängig, right? And not hanging from. And the monkey or the ape, in its imitation, but also related to play, is always hanging from. The octopus. This model of floating and tentacles and an incredible intelligence in its limbs. I think it has actually more nerves in its limbs than in the center. A beautiful model also in Willem Flusser's book on the vampire squid. Of course, that the vampire squid lives at a much deeper range than this octopus. But it is a notion of floating, and then falling as the last one. The fall of man I connected to the human figure and how it falls, and that's the point where we get to the Lucretian notion of chance and reckoning. So these 5, let's call them 5 animals. Also, the last one is an animal. They actually. What makes them different is that as figures they do act, and they're immediately by the way they're acting, they're postural. So animals as such are a very, very powerful model of what figuration means. So we're going to see a lot of the animals, and I think the most important thing is that. They're corporeal, right? So they're bodies and they're real, and which immediately displaces the notion of the figure away from the figurative, right? So it doesn't mean that they're extremely literal at this point, but they are like maybe not embodiments, but clearly by their actions and by their weight and by their physicality, they are real. So it is as you can see from the first lecture on standing, it's a form of realism. So in that sense, I quite directly connect to speculative realism. And I think in that sense, the figure is a model. Of course, we know the figure from the much earlier research of people like Auerbach from the 1930s all the way to the 50s. and then, of course, in France, with people like Michel Serres and Roland Barthes and Gilles Deleuze. But that's another type, and there's a lot of differences between them, how to actually understand the figure. But to actually say, look, the figure is a form, it is an entity, and it is a form of realism. So it does want to be a notion of the real. Now, the lecture of today is just the first three sections. It's mainly about how the grace machine relates to the gift and gift exchange, which is quite an argument in itself. And then Thursday we're going to switch to sports, looking at sports and modern notions of figuration, and then how that relates again to technology and how we can actually speak of a machine, and why, in God's name, Lars, are you speaking about a grace machine and not just about grace? So that will be the topic for Thursday. But today, I think the main question will be, the main proof actually will be to actually how does the figure, if we've introduced this notion of the figure, how can we relate that to the gift? I think that would go in multiple steps. I think from let's say the figure, we do have to move to posture, from posture to grace, and from grace to the gift. That would be the perspective from the figure, right? So all the way thinking back via posture, via grace to actually gift exchange. Historically, it's the reverse. Obviously, see, we start like with gift exchange because that's a gift exchange is extremely ancient. It's a tribal form, and how that actually involves grace. I mean, that's quite an argument in itself. And then how grace involves posture, and then how posture involves the figure. So there will be many steps. And let's see how that works out for us. This is an image. I will be talking a lot over the images. I'm not talking about the images very often. And then the images are always like double images. So there is a notion of symmetry, which we'll be discussing very often. Symmetry and asymmetry, but the whole series will be working with double images and what happens between them. So you never get like a single statement. There's always a sort of a doubling or ambiguity. Now on the left we see a potlatch, so well described by Marcel Mauss in the 1830s, and on the right we see a scattering of rice in a marriage. A wedding. That's a scattering of food, which is a very ancient form of abundance and offering, which the Romans called sparsio. There's a book of Jean Starobinski, which is called largesse, and that's what this is about. This is It immediately introduces this notion of abundance and too much. Now, of course, we know that from Bataille, the notion of excess and surplus, but it all starts with Marcel Mauss, and the idea of we have to really realize how incredibly original Marcel Mauss was with writing The Gift. There's hardly any theory on gift and gift theory and gift exchange. Maybe the figure before him was Seneca, which is 2,000 years earlier. I'm not sure if there's a lot of writing in that sense about how actually gift functions and what kind of structure it depends on. Marcel Mauss was very, very clear. Being a sociologist with so much anthropological background, there's a very strong statements, and I want to foreground two statements of Marcel Mauss. First, And Mary Douglas makes this very clear in her introduction to the book. There's no free gift. There's no free gift, and this has created a lot of interest, but also criticism in the 20th century, because Malinowski, for instance, was first completely in favor of the free gift, and he changed his mind. Derrida said, well, there's no gift actually possible, and there's no return possible. So there's a lot of twists and turns in gift theory, and how that actually sort of invaded philosophy and phenomenology. Don't forget, phenomenology is based on the notion of givenness, which is quite another idea, because this is about the gift as an object being given, and not as a gift being received in your mind. But it's a very strong idea to actually say there's no free gift. So it is obligatory to return. So there's an immediate notion of the cycle, and I think that's quite essential to understand, that this cycle is not of a nature that is sociological, anthropological, economical, or anything of such nature, and it really depends on the second statement that is so powerful in Mauss's book, and I'm going to paraphrase, and I have this in illegible handwriting where I'm trying to find it. What power resides in the given object that causes its return? What power resides in the object? What power? So it's a force of things. What power resides in the object that causes or that forces its return, right? So that means there's a cycle, and somehow the idea of the cycle is already embedded in that formulation. And why is that? Because normally you would say, okay, there's an act, and then there's an object, right? So the hand actually gives. There's an offering of an object, right? And that object, that exchange of objects, creates a social network, right? And the social substance of either the tribe or the group or set of groups, or between humans and gods or whatever. But this is different, because this actually says, no, there's the object, and the act emanates from the object, right? The object is the gift. What power resides in the object, in the given object, that causes its return? So it's not about the donor. It's not about the donor giving you something. It's actually the object itself giving itself. Now that's a circular definition. That's a circular definition. That's not just, let's say, bad ambiguity of authorship, but it's actually a circular definition. And if that circularity, if that ambiguity is not suddenly a property of language, which would always have that ambiguity unresolved, right? It would just stay there with two sides, right? With an act and then an object, and on the other side an object and then an act, or an event, or movement, right? If you just have those two on the side, it would just be for always. It would just be a scale that is in balance. But now you place that ambiguity in the world of actions, in the world of exchanges, and suddenly it becomes circular. So the circularity of the definition actually makes it possible through figuration, right, being enacted either in a tribal or whatever situation, that it becomes a cycle, right? So it's actually, we do not need any sociology, we do not need any economy, we do not need any anthropology. Don't forget, if you read anthropologists on gift exchange, it's always about this question of animism. Is there some kind of spirit of the donor that jumps into the object, and then the object presents itself through this, what they call the how, right, which is a Maori definition of the spirit of the gift. And that spirit is then, being exchanged, but it's sort of elastically still bound to the donor, so it jumps back, almost through an elasticity of giving, and then it becomes a returning. No, it's really about that ambiguity of the definition, the circularity of the definition, which would normally be like a vicious cycle. You would say, "Whoa, this is bad science," suddenly becomes a way of working, right? So the circularity becomes the cycle. So let's think a bit of what that means, because it is a question of value. I have Correggio on the left with the apple, and I have Paris on the right with the golden apple. Um, uh, what does it mean to actually sort of that thing giving itself, and what kind of notion? Well, there is value is involved. I'm not sure if it's economic value, right? Because a gift is always too much. I think that's very important. So that immediately places it out of economy, because economy, you pay for what is enough, right? You're immediately credited for something you've been handed over, right? So, and then you get a balancing. But here there's no balancing because the gift is always too much, right? That's, of course, that's what interested Bataille so much, that there's this notion of excess or surplus in the gift, and which he derived from the potlatch. But it is a very important notion because it does displace it out of the normal cycles of object and subject and economical exchange. So the fact that there is goal involved, that there is some kind of form of increase involved, that there's a notion of three. We see the three, of course, that's Aphrodite in the middle. I think it's Hera on the left and Athena on the right. It's about who's the most beautiful. Now, in itself, that's not so important, but what is important is that the giving is in some way, it's not just increase, it's also competitive. And there's a notion of shining that is involved, and a notion of beauty. So I think it is value theory, but it's an uneconomical form of value. It's a much more aesthetic form of value. And of course, normally aesthetic philosophy is always placed in the category of value theory. And I think we're doing the same thing. So I just want to be clear that when we talk about grace, I'm taking an initially aesthetic path and not a religious one, right? You can imagine if you would talk about grace from a religious point of view, you get the whole issue of resistible grace, irresistible grace, Jansenism, Arminianism, all that stuff, Saint Augustine, Saint Thomas, of course that's super interesting. But of course the main question is, why can there be two types of grace? Why can we have, how is it possible that we have a religious notion of grace as well as an aesthetic one, and how would these relate to each other? So I'm choosing deliberately, I'm choosing a path through aesthetics, and that doesn't mean I will be denying any religious interpretation of grace, but I think via aesthetics and the notion of value and exchange, we get a much clearer idea of what the role of the figure is in grace and gift exchange. So yes, excess, and there's a too much, and that too much is a shining, and that relates to beauty, and it will be a big question for us how beauty relates to grace. So enter the three graces. So the three of Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena now transform into this group. We know the painting of Botticelli. I'm not going to talk a lot about this painting, but you see the three, and then there's Hermes. I cut off Hermes on the left, and Aphrodite is now on the right, which is already a main issue, because in Homer, what is that, 800 BC or something, in the Iliad, there's no Aphrodite, there's only Charis. No, let me make this clear. it's actually pronounced as Charis. You write it as Charis. In English, there's charity, so we pronounce it with the chi, and then we have charisma, and we pronounce it with the K. So there's many ways of pronouncing it. The French, you often see from French authors writing about Charis, they actually write it with Kharis, and they would pronounce it as Charis. But it's actually in ancient Greece and in modern Greece, it would be the CH is the he, and it would be fricative, so that means Charis. So you will have to practice a bit on this. But that's the main figure. So in Homer, Charis and Aphrodite, because in Charis is first married to Hephaestus, and then in the Odyssey, it's Aphrodite who's married to Hephaestus. So there's a confusing relationship between Charis and Aphrodite, right? So get the notion of beauty and grace are already mixed at that point, like from very, very early on. And it's only with Hesiod, which is about 100 years later, that we get the separation of the three graces. Now, I'm not sure how that actually relates to Greek cults at that time, but the cults of the graces are very, very ancient. They come from Boeotia and Orchomenos. And so there were already very early on, there were three goddesses and not one. But what's interesting is that these three somehow relate to the oneness of Aphrodite. So what is split in the Botticelli painting was actually quite confused and merged from very early on. So we get that 3 and 1. And I think what's important is that Aphrodite is a figure of towardness, of shining. We know it from the other Botticelli painting, the Birth of Venus. But she plays like a major role in all mythologies, while the Graces always play a covert role. Right, and I think that's always the role of these triads, of these mythological triads, which are always women. It's not just the Charites, the Graces, the three Graces. It's also the Horai, the three of the seasons, and the Moirai, the three of fate, and of course, obviously the notion of fate. Time, the end being linked back to the start and prophecy, the seasons, the cycle of the seasons, and the cycle of exchange are intimately related. So we have this idea of Charis, and if you actually read some of the epic poems from ancient Greece, you will find many types of meanings for Charis, and all translators have enormous problems finding the right translation. It means generosity, it means charm, it means actual compensation. When Achilles is his anger, he feels that his Charis is not compensated by Agamemnon. Sometimes it's charisma, right? When Odysseus is anointed with oil and with his black hair, seducing and charming, that's also a form of charis, which we would call charisma or charisma. So there's many types of meanings. It's been very well researched by Bonnie McLachlan in her book, The Age of Grace, which is quite a beautiful book. So we do need to understand that the notion of because this is all not mentioned in Marcel Mauss, right? This is, he does mention the notion of exchange, of giving, receiving, and returning. Right, so that's a major issue for him. But for the rest, it's a study of tribal culture and economy, and so it never really relates to ancient Greece and specifically to Hellenic Greece, because at that time, especially during Hellenic Stoicism, it became a major issue, right? Epicurus, Chrysippus. There's a lot of writing about grace and gratitude and generosity, and how that actually probably it's all evolved out of Aristotle's in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he discusses the gift and its functioning in the polis. So that comes from Stoic culture. But Mauss is not really referring to that, so he misses this aesthetic component very strongly, right? And I think from the notion of value theory being displaced from economy, actually an aesthetic understanding of this, of abundance or liberality or generosity is quite important. Now, let's see. There's many depictions of the graces. First, they're linear. It's not really clear why. So Hermes is now in the image on the right. You see Hermes is at the front, playing his double flute, the aulos, and then there's Aglaia at the front who's bearing fruit, and then the three are connected by a piece of cloth, and then there's Cupid again. Cupid we already saw, like in this painting, so Cupid being connected to Aphrodite, so Cupid is the little guy at the end. So that's a linear dance, but it is a dance. So they're not like three still figures, they're actually moving. It's not really clear why it's a linear dance, because probably we know that Greek dance was very geometric at that time, so there must have been some kind of ring dance or round dance as well. So it must be also having to do with the fact that there were no proper statues at that moment. Most of it was relief or high relief, and that allows you to depict a dancing group only as in single file, so to speak, as being aligned and lined up. So there are slow changes, and the most powerful idea is how do you actually do that in relief? How do you actually depict a circular organization? And you do that by turning the middle figure around, right? So suddenly Aglaia, it's probably Aglaia in the middle, is turned backward. And she's touching both figures on the left and right, and the figures on the left and right are touching each other, though we can't really see that. But that must be, so this is a flat depiction of a circular organization, right, in that sense, which is a very smart and from an aesthetic point, like a major step in the understanding of the graces as a circular organization. You see how so this is actually a Roman copy. They all lost their heads, but you start to see that the limbs are actually starting to play a major role. They're all sort of in a state of buckling. There's a lot of weakening or softening of the figures. They hold on to each other. I think this is a first century BC Roman copy of a Greek sculpture or relief, but you can still see that they're in a linear position. So often sculptures at that time were posited against the wall, so you couldn't walk around them. Now in modern museums, of course, you can walk around them, but most of the time these were understood as a three-dimensional relief, so to speak. Now, what you do start to see is now with the three being connected, that you can actually get this argument of Seneca, that the three graces actually do depict the stages of the gift cycle. So that means giving, receiving, and returning. So the giving, that is really the shining figure. So that's the That's the transformation of Aphrodite in this new figure, Aglaia. And Aglaia actually literally means shining or radiance, right? So we have to understand that she's the shining figure. And then there's the second one, Euphrosyne. Euphrosyne means well-spirited, right? EU is or EV is means good or well, and then Euphrosyne relates to the mind and the spirit and the head. So it's well-spirited, and there's not a lot of depictions of Euphrosyne, and there's only one where she's drinking. So she's feasting. It actually means a form of joy, but there's intake, right? So while Aglaia is shining outward, Euphrosyne is taking in, right? So we get a transformation in that receiving figure that becomes like an absorptive figure, right? That's the figure that takes in, and it's quite important to understand that she's drinking or eating, because it's that same connection of fruit that we saw with the golden apple and the scattering of rice. So the notion of fruit and food always play an important role. The third figure, Thalia, actually means bloom. That's not a form of increase, but it's a returning of that increase into or a turning of that notion of intake. Into an increase, right? So we got Aglaia as an outward figure, then Euphrosyne as an inward figure taking in, and Thalia again outwardly directed as a notion of prosperity, of maybe also wealth, but certainly a form of growth and bloom. Now this is really important, because it means that Thalia is actually taking Aglaia's position. That is a returning, right? So you get that idea of an exchange, and don't forget, like from a Western point of view, this is very complex, because you cannot really explain this in an object-subject relationship. We are always like thinking in dualities, right? We are always thinking in dualities or in dialectics. And there's always the object and there's the subject. But what this means is actually that subject is transforming. You're not the same anymore after the intake. And after the intake, you're taking the position of the first one, of the object, right? So in an object-subject framework, this is almost inexplicable, because now you get three figures and not two, right? Or you get three stages. Now that's another important thing, because we cannot really say what the figure is and what the movement, or what is the figure and what is the action, right? So I'm drawing it here as a diagram: Aglaia, Euphrosyne, Thalia, radiance, joy, and bloom. But that's not really correct, because Aglaia means she's giving, so that's already the arrow. Right, and the arrow in a diagram means action, right? So we having the object, which is understood through that little circle with its contour as a body, and then that body is acting and it becomes an event, right? So again, we get this confusing ambiguity of what is object and what is action. Right. So again, there's the circularity that we talked about a bit earlier, of act first and then object and then act. That circularity is now fully worked out, right? As a circle of three stages, as a giving and a receiving and a returning. And often this returning is called a thanking, obviously, which we find a lot in Heidegger. This Duncan, this thanking, gratitude, obviously directly related to gratia, is essential. But what it also means is that the feeling of gratitude is as important as the returning of the gift by an object. right? So initially, especially in Marshall Mauss, it is an exchange of objects, and the people sort of disappear and appear behind and in front of these objects. But in this case, we have a much deeper ambiguity of object and action, or object and event, which I think is quite essential. Now let's see if we the sculpture on the right is Canova, Antonio Canova, of course, this sort of epitome and the apex of neoclassicism. You can see how they share the cloth. You can see how they share and lean on each other, and how their limbs are almost like being exchanged. How Aglaia is a bit higher than the other two, Aglaia being in the middle. But also now they're not aligned on a single line anymore, but they're actually becoming a spatial object. So in this case, it does become a sculpture that you can walk around and see from different angles. So there's the giving, receiving, and returning as a shining, an intake, and an increase. There's the ambiguity of object and activity, which I think this is actually the core of the argument. Is like this: if there's an object movement relationship that we cannot fully figure out, that we cannot say, okay, it's the movement and then the object, or the object and then the movement, or the event, or the action, then we got something very essential in the understanding of the aesthetic. It relates directly to, let's say, the cycle as a start and a beginning. It relates to the three being a dancing figure, but also a sculpture standing still, right? So being an object in repose, because statue means stands, right? So there's again, you get this. Are they moving and dancing? Obviously, in Botticelli, it seems like they're dancing, but in Canova, they're standing. Well, that's the problem of sculpture in general, especially when it's a statue. So we get a lot of these ambiguities that revolve around this doubling of three and one, of dancing and standing still, of object and movement, that keep on playing a role in the understanding of the figure. Now, to understand where we are, so I'm moving from gift now to charis, to grace, and I'm slowly moving towards posture. So what we have is these four. I reverse them: gift, grace, posture, and figure. So we're moving towards the third step now. Is the idea of how does posture actually play a role? And I think before we get to that, I think it's very important to understand that the idea of charis was actually always opposed or related or countered with the idea of semnos. These are 2 pages from Jerome Pollitt's beautiful book on the aesthetics of ancient Greece, and this old terminology. Charis and semnos, semnos meaning august, auctoritas. I'm really giving the Latin. He's giving the Latin translation, but also gravitas and pondus. That means there's some kind of opposition in the thinking of grace in relation to gravity. It's not by accident. That's the title of the book. It's also no accident that was the title of Simone Weil's book. Simone Weil, was it? It's a posthumous book, but it's actually titled Gravity and Grace. This is a very, very old opposition. So in ancient Greece, it's charis and semnos. In Roman Latin, it became gratia or venustas, actually, as opposed to gravitas. And then, of course, grace and gravity. Before it becomes grace and gravity again, it's actually grace and dignity. Not just with Henry Home, I think that's the 1760s when he writes his Dignity and Grace in his Elements of Criticism, and because it becomes Anmut und Würde in the thinking of Friedrich Schiller. Würde, worth, value, self-worth, clearly a sense of weight related to it. Worth is a sense of value. So we're getting to this opposition of grace and gravity, which means that we got a new set of concepts, and it's not just the object and movement that we were just discussing, which relates very much to charis, but in Semnos we got this issue of verticality, which I think it will be a major issue in how we understand how grace and gift exchange and the figure are actually constructed. It translates the grace and gravity seems to be a subcategory in the 17th and 18th century of beauty and sublimity. I think this is true. It's also highly problematic. These concepts are very, very complex, so you have to bear with me. I think the object action is already a very complex argument, but talking about grace and gravity or charis and semnos, Anmut und Würde, that is quite another matter, very, very complicated. Now, what's interesting is that in Edmund Burke, what's that, the 1740s, which is about the inquiry on the beautiful and the sublime, there's just a super small paragraph on grace, right? It's just between delicacy and sympathy and spontaneity and all. I mean, it's an incredibly influential book, and it was very influential to Kant, and the same for Schiller and all the German authors writing about beauty and sublimity. And it's just like the smallest sentence, and gracefulness is an idea belonging to posture and motion. And he says a lot there. Because how is it possible that you can have something, an aesthetic quality, be related to posture, which is a form of repose or stillness, right? And motion. Right, so somehow grace is capable of, as an aesthetic, of being related both to standstill or something like posture, because posture doesn't mean literally standstill. It's somehow, it is an understanding of motion through standstill. Now, this is already a sort of acrobatic formulation, but he just says it. He just says it, and he just puts them together, posture and motion. Okay, there we have posture. And then there's this other thing, je ne sais quoi. I highlighted it here. It's French, but it's actually a translation of the. We get to this from the Italian un certo non so che, which is a sentence by Firenzuola. Anyway. What we now have is, okay, there's an acceptance of this ambiguity of movement and standstill, or object and movement, or posture and motion. And on the other hand, we have this sense of indeterminacy, je ne sais quoi, which relates to vagueness. It relates to the shining of Aglaia. There's Firenzuola. We will get to him. He describes it very well as a because normally you can see parts of things, but in the sense of je ne sais quoi, we somehow see all the parts together. We cannot take certain parts out and say, okay, this is the actual aspect of beauty or grace. We can actually, there's a je ne sais quoi. So there's something about it, but you cannot pinpoint it. right? This is a beautiful sentence, and it actually belongs to grace. So we get these two very important. It's just one paragraph, but he says like two very important things. Posture and motion are linked, and there's je ne sais quoi. This indeterminacy is directly related to it. And then we get to Schiller. I'm sorry, this is all in German, but the actors will be reading all this in translation in English. Anmut ist eine bewegliche Schönheit, eine Schönheit nämlich, die an ihr Subjekte zufällig entstehen und ebenso aufhören kann. Dadurch unterscheidet sie sich von der fixen Schönheit, die mit dem Subjekt selbst notwendig gegeben ist. Bewegliche Schönheit. Now, that's the standard definition of grace. This is the standard definition of grace. He means the beauty of motion, because a few times in Grace and Dignity, which is the translation of über Anmut und Würde, he actually calls it the beauty of motion. But here he says bewegliche Schönheit. So it is a sense of Schönheit, of beauty. But beauty for him is always fixed. Right, because beauty is actually fixed Schönheit, right? So it's a fixed beauty. So we're right in the middle of ambiguity here, right? So the core of the problem is not so much to figure out what happens between Anmut and Würde, between grace and dignity, but actually between grace and beauty, right? So he's already struggling with the definition of how do we actually define grace as a subcategory of beauty, or are they somehow on an even par, right, where one is modifying the other, right? So this is very important. Now, of course, you can have like a whole seminar, a whole semester just about Schiller. It's quite well known that first it comes from Kant, from his reading of Kant and the idea of subjectivity. So he wants to transform that a bit back to the object, that there's actually a lot of beauty and grace on the side of the object. But he's also referring to authors such as Mendelssohn and Winkelmann, and especially Burke, because they all read Burke, all the German romanticists read Burke in translation. What is it? It's like 40 years later, right? So I think Anmut und Würde is in the 1790s, and the Inquiry of Burke is in the 1740s. So there's like almost a half a century difference between them. But there is this issue, is like, okay, how do we define grace? And in his case, it's like, okay, how do we define grace in relationship to dignity? Now, dignity is obviously a sense of stance. It's a sense of self-esteem even, which I relate to Themos in the discussion of standing and the work of Fukuyama and Sloterdijk. But there is a sense of self-esteem and self-assertion in dignity or self-worth, right? So, and how does it then relate to grace? And for him, it's like reasoning from Kant, right, where you have the opposition of reason and sensibility, which is the romantic issue, obviously, is that where, okay, the duty, right, doing your duty, a moral duty, is related to reason, and sensibility, following your feelings or having feelings, is related to grace or the expression of those, the free expression of those feelings, and they can be in conflict with each other. Obviously, following your desires, your eros, right? If you think of Plato, right? Logos, themos, eros, right? Reason, spiritedness, or anger, right? And then desire. We can have like, okay, we follow a desire, but then there's the conflict with logos, right? So if there is a conflict, he actually puts it on the side of sublimity, right? So there's this weight that you have to bear. And you're feeling the weight more, right? The more you are in conflict. And when they're in harmony with each other, then there is a notion of grace. So that the grace-dignity opposition actually follows how you deal with reason and sensibility for Schiller, right? So reasoning coming from Kant, right? How do we actually solve that? either by harmonization, which is the notion of grace. So what's interesting here is that grace is not just free flowing. It's not pure rhythm. It's not just pure inside outism. Is that English? It's not pure inside outism. Horrible term. Because it does involve moral duty. It's just in pure harmony with that moral duty. Now, this is almost literally St. Paul, right? So I don't want to make it immediately a religious discussion, but in St. Paul, it's quite clear that in the epistles, he talks about the law of works and the law of grace. And that grace is not just like not ergon, but actually dealing with ergon in such a way that it comes out of you, that it grows from your inside out, right? So of course moral duty is an outside in position, right? Because that's a weight you have to bear, like a duty. But now you're doing that duty as if it naturally comes from you. Now there's a lot of as if here, there's a lot of transformations, but that's sort of the essential, what Schiller is saying. And that's a very important idea, because it means you cannot simply oppose grace and gravity. Grace involves gravity, right? While gravity itself does not involve grace. So they're not on equal par. They're not on equal par. Grace is actually a way of dealing with duty and dealing with gravity, right? So that's important. It's not a simple opposition of vertical gravity and horizontal grace, which is all about exchanges and sort of happy joy and drinking and feasting. And then there's gravity on the other side, as if you have structure here and ornament there, or leisure here and work over here. It's really the idea of grace being involved in gravity and duty. And of course, that's why at a certain point Schiller starts to talk about a play, right? Spieltrieb, the drive to play. It's not just a poor expression of freedom. It's not just as pure, because he talks about the architectonic frame of the human body. Right, so we, in a state of grace, we are not escaping our architectonic frame. He actually talks about the technique of the menschlichen Bau, right? So the technology, the technology of the human frame. Now, I don't want to put this into Heidegger immediately, but look, this frame is then a flexible frame, and it finds freedom by itself. That means that frame and freedom are not opposed from the viewpoint of grace, right? So Schiller's making a huge move, but he's making this move reading it through the statement of Burke, right? So because there's the object movement ambiguity. So that's what we're going to do. It's like, okay, there's this movement and object, and they both transform into each other. So when movement transforms or finds its object or becomes an object, when an event becomes an object, that's what Graham Harman would say, right? When an event becomes an object, it actually appears, right? So movement and object are in themselves are not so important. It's really about that middle axis, and that middle axis is one of figuration. Right, that's where things appear. Right, it's almost like a line of consciousness. So and we have now grace and beauty as the central pair of aesthetics, not beauty and sublimity. Sublimity somehow is like expelled to the outside. It's like on the side somewhere, right? Obviously, beauty involves sublimity, but sublimity does not involve beauty. So there's an asymmetry between them, while with grace and beauty there is a symmetry, right? So one is transforming in the other. So movement transforming into an object, right? Which is quite different than the beauty of motion, right? It's really that motion itself finding a contour and then being a state of grace, right? As a figure, right? So that we see already the ambiguity of a movement And that for beauty is going in the reverse direction. It is an object that becomes a movement. So the idea of towardness, of shining, of indeterminacy, of je ne sais quoi, this is all an offering, right? That's all an offering, and that is the act. That is the movement, right? So we got beauty on the side of an object transforming into a movement, and grace on the side of an object of a movement becoming an object, right? So this diagram sort of displaces that opposition that drove aesthetics. Let's not forget about how this happened, right? It happens all with Plato, right? So beauty, I mean, it comes from above, right? Everything in Plato comes from above. And in his seeing of beauty, the ekphanestaton, right? The seeing, the claritas, the seeing of beauty is really something that breaks in from above. So in Plato, you always see this sort of oscillation. What later becomes beauty and sublimity. But it's in the descriptions of Plato, it's sometimes it's pure love, right? Pure horizontality. Immediately falls in love with the boy with the fiery eyes, right? And then he describes it again as terror. And we know this opposition, right? This is where beauty and Schrecken and terror are always like sort of oscillating. And then, this from Plato that slowly transforms. I mean, Plato works with the solar model, right? It's always the radiating sun that shines over everything. We know it from Bataille too. For Bataille, it's quite clear that the notion of excess is directly related to the sun. You cannot look into the sun, right? You would burn your eyes. You would blind yourself. So there's a not seeing, and that is again this sort of okay. Is there pure joy, or is there pure horror or terror? And so we see with Plato, this idea of the two, the white horse and the black horse, are actually still merged. And then later that separates into a solar model and let's say a lightning model, right? So with Longinus, when he speaks of the rhetoric of the high, right, of the perihypsos, right, which makes basically mean on the high, on the erhabene, right, on the elevated. It comes from above, but it is thunder, right? In Longinus, it's already thunder, right? So we got the solar model, and that suddenly changes into the thunder model, right? This obviously this comes from 19th century philology, Max Müller, people like that, with the solar mythology. Actually, Max Müller is very interesting because he wrote about the Charites as being directly derived from Sanskrit, from the Veda, where the horses that pull the chariot of the sun of radiance are actually called the Haritas, right? So the word har actually means shine already in ancient Sanskrit, right? So going from Sanskrit to Greek actually is the transformation of the horses that carry the shining, again the movement and the object over to the Charites. So Max Müller with the solar model. Let me see where I'm going now. I'm going to slowly move in a bit more of that understanding of verticality, because in German, different than in English, obviously grace in English, and that's quite beautiful about it, is that it always has these multiple meanings, right? If you would talk to somebody, to a Catholic, they would understand the word grace is completely different when you would talk to somebody interested in aesthetics, right? And Anmut is a very aesthetic term. It's really something that comes from the object generally, right? It's anmutigen is really almost like a cheering on, right? It's actually in Dutch, aanmoedigen means cheering on, right? So it's a very offering relationship. And then the other translation of the word grace in German would be Gnade, right? And that'd be the religious term, right? So Anmut is really this inside out, while Gnade is really something that comes from the outside in, right? So what's interesting about English is that these both the words are the same, and that means that there must be some kind of relationship between this inside out and this outside in, that they must be looped. Now, this idea of transcendence is not unimportant. Of course, if you would start a discussion on grace from a religious point of view, you would have a huge problem moving toward the aesthetic sense of it. Now, we are in the reverse problem. If we start like with an aesthetic route, how do we actually explain the religious understanding of it? Now, by actually appreciating the verticality, it's a very structural terminology. I think there's it's almost like architectonic explanations of the model of the grace machine and how grace works, right? I mean, working is already an important term in this case. Actually tells us, there is in grace, it's not free from that verticality. It actually tries to involve it. Now, we also know that this verticality has now two meanings. One is looking upward, which we know so well from the sublime, because it's elevated and high, the hypsos, right? So there's the magnificence over there. But we also talked about the reverse. So that vertical axis has two directions. One is upward, right, towards magnificence or splendor, das Prächtige, according to Kant. And then there's the downward, is that the world of the pondus, of the serious, of the weighty, of duty, right, that weighs down, of bearing and carrying. So that's incredibly important, that we got this vertical axis pointing in two directions. And that doesn't mean that, okay, it's quite obvious that, Christianity claimed that vertical axis, especially the upward notion. I mean, we know from Nietzsche, who called Platonism, who called Christianity a Platonism for the people, right? So, and in that sense, that's a correct remark, because it's saying, okay, that there is this vertical axis, but there's quite a claim on this idea of transcendence by Christianity. Of course, in their mind, transcendence really means a second space, right? So we inhabit a first space, and then there's a second space that can be inhabited and occupied. Now, that's really questionable, obviously, from a philosophical point of view, but that's not so important here. What is important is that in the understanding of grace, that verticality always exists. And what either Christianity or aesthetics or whatever theory of gift and the figure and grace are doing with it, it still exists. Right? It doesn't mean it's true, but there are it is very important to understand how Anmut and Gnade, how this sort of vertical and horizontal are linked up with each other. So as a definition, I would say, yes, grace is an act. It is something that you make happen, but it is also something that happens to you, right? So it is a being moved as well as a moving, right? It is an act, but it's also an undergoing of action, right? Which is a passivity, right? So we cannot understand grace as a pure flowing, as Pierre Hadot would do, or as a pure activity, right? It's not just, it is really this turn, right? Now, the word turn is quite essential here because turn translates as tropos. And if you're in the world of tropos, you're immediately in the world of the figure, right? And that's from a rhetorical point of view, but it's also a point of view from posture. So in that sense, Anmut is a sort of a lightening of that weight. If we would understand it in this structure of horizontal and vertical, Anmut would be, yes, there is a notion of rhythm, but it actually transforms this seriousness into something that is light, or it actually transforms this sense of moral duty and heaviness into something that's light. So grace is not by itself light. Right? Kleist, for instance, Heinrich von Kleist calls it anti-grav. Very strange term. It's anti-gravity. But that's not really true. It's really a transformation of weightiness into a lightness. So it's not pure lightness by itself. Right? Now let's go to trying to understand what this indeterminacy is. It's quite a beautiful book, Della Bellezza della Donna, from Angelo Firenzuola. I think we're talking about the 1540s. I'm not exactly sure, but it does speak about un certo non so che. I highlighted it on the left. A certain something I don't know. Non so che means I don't really know. I don't really know. A certain not knowing. So there is it does expand beyond the idea of knowledge and consciousness. I think that's sort of essential about it. So there is an idea of grace, and Firenzuola talks a lot about Aglaia, talks a lot about shining. She shines rays outward, but this shining is a shine of indeterminacy. So again, the idea of ambiguity is not like a passive ambiguity that just remains as a state. It is really a sort of shining out. It is a form of appearing. But it is a form of appearing not as clarity, but as something that is blurred, right? So it comes over us. There is an immediately too much. We cannot fully grasp it, right? There's not a full grasping of the non-so-che. Now, the other figure in the same period is much more well-known, Baldassare Castiglione, who wrote the book of the courtier, and of course. It's a very important book, the Book of the Courtier, and in this case, it's already very early translated in English, and we find in Firenzuola and in Castiglione, we find sort of opposing terms, or maybe not opposing, but slightly different terms for what grace is, and it's very important for Castiglione how to behave in the court. Now, this is about aristocracy. So aristocracy already means you're acting on the vertical axis, right? Because you're dealing with power. You're dealing with power. So you have to act in a certain environment gracefully. And the term he uses is sprezzatura. And sprezzatura is very difficult to translate, and there's many different translations. It means a certain nonchalance. It means a certain, and here it's translated with negligence. That's not fully correct, but it means a certain lightness, a certain ease. Obviously, grace is often associated with ease, but it means and in the book of, I have a book here by Paolo D'Angelo on sprezzatura, and he relates it to this beautiful formulation of grace as the art of concealing art. Ars et celare artem. Art is the hiding of art. Art is the hiding of art. So we are meted again in this whole world of ambiguities and contradictions and paradoxes. So art is not pure artificiality, but it's the hiding of artificiality. Ease is not ease. It's not taking things lightly. It's taking heavy things lightly, right? It's taking it actually comes from difficulty, because you're like in the court, so you're like in these relations that are highly conflicted and problematic, and of course the sprezzatura does refer to some kind of elegance or virtuosity, right? What I find interesting about the term vaghezza on the left is that this word un certo non so che, this je ne sais quoi, actually now gets a term. Vaghezza, vagueness. There's a really beautiful piece of writing by Firenzuola, who says, look, we find the word vaghi in Boccaccio and in Petrarca and Fiammetta, and it means not just vagueness, it also means charm, and it means movement, like the word vagabond, right, or vague in French, vague as a wave. So you get these much more complex terminologies being related to the word vaghezza in opposition to the word sprezzatura. So sprezzatura is actually quite problematic, and it's much more an enacting of something. Now, how and what it enacts is truly interesting, but the word vaghezza actually gets to the heart of the matter. It says, look, there's this indeterminacy that is an indeterminacy of charm and beauty as well as movement, right? So he's actually much closer to the problem. And now, this sprezzatura does refer to concealment, a hiding of something, and I think that Nietzsche translates it as second nature, and there we get to the discussion of habit as well. It's like, how do you make something second nature, right? By transforming a first nature, or by adapting first nature to something that is far more complex, right? So to actually make something a second nature, so to actually show as if it is natural, while it's not natural at all, it is extremely artificial. Now, I'm jumping a bit through time, but just to give you more examples, is I've found some, and there's a lot of material on grace, obviously, but there's also very interesting relations between grace and habit, and I think we have to pinpoint a few of those authors. One is Samuel Butler, 1870s, and Félix Ravizon from the 1830s. What's really beautiful about, Samuel Butler is of course the famous author of the Book of Machines in Erewhon, where you get these 3 chapters. Then we get a Darwinist description of the evolution of machines, and this is the most incredible thing. And he talks about technology as being prosthetic, but while it's prosthetic, you lose consciousness, or you get a diminished consciousness, and we know that from either using a hammer or driving a car. It's not like every time you drive a car you're completely conscious of what you're doing. No, you actually become the car, like you become the hammer. Now, in my perspective, that's also a mimetic relationship. You have to absorb mimetically the car or the hammer to actually extend that piece of technology as a prosthetic element. So it's not pure prosthesis, it's actually mimesis and prosthesis. So, but we'll get to that later when we discuss technology. So Samuel Butler is a fascinating figure, and in his book Life and Habit, he writes about habit similarly to Félix Ravizon as a form of grace, and he is actually opposing craft and knowledge, or craft and engineering, as engineering that always struggles with consciousness, right? So engineering is knowing what you should do. It's always a clarity. There's always this separation of your consciousness and the thing that you're doing, because you know that you know. But in craft, there is a knowing where you don't know exactly what you're doing. Or let me rephrase this: knowing without knowing that you know, right? So there's not an indirect consciousness, but a direct consciousness. It's a knowing with your body, right? And he calls this an unconsciousness, right? Now the word unconscious and unconsciousness is much older than the use of Freud, right? It comes from Schelling, right? 1790s, early 1800s, and it transforms over the 19th century till it sort of lands in the hands of Sigmund Freud. But here in the 1870s, there is already a discussing of unconsciousness. But it's not a repressed unconsciousness. It's actually the point where things are done without being interrupted by knowledge. So what he writes is actually we are no longer, so to speak, under the law, but under grace. Now it's quite clear that you're doing your work, but you're doing it in a way that it requires no effort, right? So again, it's not pure ease. It's actually doing something difficult with ease, right? So again, it involves gravity and heaviness and seriousness. It's not pure play. It's actually a playing of seriousness, right? So that sentence at the end, again, relates directly to St. Paul, right? For St. Paul, it's doing work. Really the most interesting figure in Christianity. Nietzsche was quite obsessed by St. Paul. I'm calling him St. Paul, not because I'm a Catholic, but it's not very often you can call people a saint. So I'm taking the liberty to actually use the Catholic formulation of terminology. So we are no longer under the law, but we're under grace. Now this refers quite directly to Félix Ravizon, the 1830s, right? So and we're getting very close to the idea of posture, of figuration. So the loi de grâce, the law of grace. The law of grace is actually a law of members, right? A law of the limbs, a law of the limbs. When we get to the standing figure, we'll see that how Leonardo da Vinci describes the grace in the limbs of the standing figure, the serpentinato or the sebejjar, the snaking, undulating figure that is standing. So he's referring a lot to that. Ravizon did a 30-year study of the Venus de Milo. He was very interested in this whole idea of the serpentine figure that we know from Hogarth and mannerism, obviously. So that's how all this research comes into the philosopher of habit, Félix Ravizon, just from the book De l'Habitude, right? So it's on habit. But he actually describes it as prevenient grace, right? So habit is quite directly related to grace, which is quite problematic. And there's a lot of misunderstandings about this. For instance, Pierre Hadot really reads Félix Ravizon as pure flow, right? It's pure flow. So it's all rhythm, and habit directly goes into grace, in a state of grace. Now, obviously, we've been describing this transition of grace and gravity, and how gravity is involved, and how passivity is involved in action. So it cannot be just called like pure flow, and it cannot just be an extension of habit, the automatism of habit. There needs to be a break into a non-habitual state, which is the moment of grace. So it's not a pure inside out, it's also this outside in, being looped. So it's not you being like in a state of elegance or spontaneity or naturalness. No, there's always this sort of transition of outside in and inside out, of being moved and moving. So this idea of habit breaks into a non-habitual state. Now, habit literally means having, habere, and that quite directly opposes the idea of the gift, right? Anything you have, you cannot properly give, right? So what's interesting about this term, grâce prévenante, prevenient grace, is that it's usually translated either as resistible grace in Catholic terms, or enabling grace. Enabling. Now, habit is directly, through the word habere, is related to ability or able, right? So habit is being able. But prevenient grace, it means actually being enabled. So it's God in us. So the idea of transcendence returns here. It's now God in us. That's what he writes here. It says Dieu en nous, Dieu caché par cela. So that means that he's actually quite aware of this transition of the inside out and the outside in. So habit can never be directly flowing into grace. It needs to be enabled. So in that sense, I think we'd have to compare Ravezon and Heidegger. Ravezon on the side of habit, and in German Gewohnheit, and Heidegger on the side of wohnen, right? Normally translated as dwelling, but it's actually an inhabiting, right? So we got two sides, able and unable. Heidegger on the side of wohnen, and Ravezon on the side of habit, and what we should try to do is like put them on top of each other or link them to each other, right? So that the abling is fed by the enabling, and the enabling is fed by the abilities, right? So there's a looping system of inside out and outside in. Now let me see how far we are. We're a bit, of course, I'm always long. So breaking away into this not having actually means giving, right? So, but it's not pure gift. It's not a giving away because it's being returned. So, and it's quite essential that we have this ambiguity of habit and non-habit, or having and giving, right? So the gift does not mean a giving away, right? Because it's being returned. It's elastic in that sense, right? So do we have this ambiguity? So it's not pure enabling, and it's not pure ability. It's a circularity of these two. Now I'm almost at the end, maybe 5 or 10 more minutes. And then we read Bergson. And this is a text from The Creative Mind, the life and work of Ravezon. I think it's the occasion is that he's doing a lecture, I think for the Academy, about Ravezon, and he's talking about Leonardo da Vinci, and this is quite funny, because let's see where we get to the end. Now, if we ask ourselves which are the movements that describe beautiful forms, we find that they are the graceful movements. So we're right in this sort of movement object transition. Beauty, said Leonardo da Vinci, is arrested grace. So beauty is not Schiller's fixe Schönheit, right? But we get over here, fixe Schönheit. No, it's actually fixed grace, right? So what we have now is two modifiers, right? So grace cannot be only defined through beauty. Beauty can also not only being defined by grace, right? So the idea is that, okay, Schiller is right that when he says grace is movable beauty, but that means that the reverse definition is also true, that beauty is arrested grace, right? So we got a definition of 1793 that is now answered and responded by Bergson in the reverse mode as an arrested grace, right? So beauty is not fixed beauty, but it's actually fixed grace, right? So they change position, and they're modifiers of each other. Each thing manifests in the movement recorded by its form. Movement recorded by its form. So we write in the top of that diagram the infinite generosity of a principle which gives itself. So what he's doing here is relating this idea of shining, right, directly to the idea of generosity, right? So he's actually saying, look, Ravizon solved this incredibly important problem of having these two types of grace. One is of liberality, right? The act of liberality characteristic of the divine goodness. Now let's leave out the divine goodness, but it's liberality, pure generosity, and how that is related to the aesthetic of shining and beauty. Obviously, that's one of the main problems of philosophy, is how goodness, not so much in a moral sense, but in a Platonic sense of a continuous shining and giving and offering and a state of benefit, how that actually becomes aesthetic shining, and how that shining actually relates to an indeterminacy of the thing, right? So I think this is where we end. I would like to start like Thursday on with the idea of how this relates to a machine. If there's a way of relating the grace machine to machines of technology. So that's what we're going to do Thursday. But here I would like to conclude this lecture, how grace and the figure relate to each other.